This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we are discussing with Professor Barry Latzer his new book, The Rise and Fall of Violent Crime in America. He is the Emeritus Professor of Criminal Justice at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and he is a former member of the doctoral faculty in criminal justice at City University of New York Graduate School. He is the author of numerous articles on capital punishment and criminal procedural law, including death penalty cases, a textbook that's in its third edition, or casebook, I should say. And he's also written 2 books on state constitutional criminal procedure. Professor Latzer, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Richard. I'm delighted to be with you.
So, your book, as you know, there are no shortage of books trying to understand both the rise in violent crime that we experienced beginning in the 1960s, and then which occurred for the next roughly 30 years, and then this sort of dramatic downturn. And all sorts of theories are proffered. Probably the one that we hear the most about is the broken windows theory of policing, or get tough approach on crime and sentencing. We know largely that politically conservatives seem to benefit from their approach to tackling this uptick in crime and seem to benefit from its downturn. What's distinctive, though, about your book within this conversation?
What I've tried to do is put the rise in crime in the late 60s, starting in the late 60s, and the big decline in crime in the 90s in a historical perspective. I tried to show the social history of the United States during this period, and I also wanted to examine violent crime, and did examine violent crime in other periods as well. Although this book begins with the 1940s, the research I did and the manuscript I wrote actually goes back to the 19th century. But I guess the publication business being what it is, the publisher said, well, let's just publish the part of the manuscript dealing with the modern period, the 1940s on, and then we'll see about publishing the rest of it. So I was very interested in, and still am, in the historical development in terms of violent crime, because I think they have a lot to teach us.
So let's talk about that briefly. You don't just start with kind of where I started and think about 1965 forward, but you start with the Great Depression and violent crime during the Great Depression, and then during the mobilization for war in World War II. What does that add to a conversation about violent crime?
Well, I didn't do much on the Depression in this book, but I did do the research on it, as I say, for the full manuscript.
Well, you do have a discussion of the 1930s. You talk about
briefly.
Okay. Yeah.
Right, and there's a lot more to be said about it. But anyway, the point is this. The 30s is fascinating from the standpoint of violent crime, because at the beginning of that decade, violent crime was soaring, and in fact, it was a major issue. It was a big media issue. A lot of the famous gangsters were out on the loose, and eventually were all caught and killed or imprisoned. Ma Barker and Bonnie and Clyde were out there as well. Babyface Nelson, and the whole list of rather famous but very violent robbers and murderers. So crime was definitely high in the early 30s, and it was certainly a big focal point for the media and for the general public. Now, what's fascinating is probably the worst years of the Depression were 31, 32. 33 perhaps. So here you have this massive economic downturn in which there's probably around 25% unemployment rate in the United States. And even those who are working are really put on a schedule where they're only working, in effect, part-time. time because the companies aren't able to pay them. So here you have this massive economic downturn, and violent crime is very high. And I think most people would say, well, no surprise. When you have such massive economic dislocation, you get high violent crime. The only problem is the rest of the decade belies that conclusion. Starting in 1934, crime begins to go down and actually keeps on going down right really into the early 1960s. So we have the start of what I call a major crime trough. And yet the Depression continued. In fact, in 37 and 38, the rebound of the economy actually went backwards and started to decline again, yet crime kept falling. So the conclusion for the 30s is that there isn't a clear relationship between general economic conditions and violent crime, because sometimes the conditions are bad and crime is high, and sometimes exactly the opposite.
And of course, I'm sure you can talk about this more. The 1960s, the last half of the 1960s, is a very prosperous time in the country, and that's when we have this upsurge in crime.
Exactly.
Particularly in large cities, yeah.
And I was just going to add, and more recently in the Great Recession, as it's come to be called, 2007, 2008, the economy tanks, and yet we're in another crime trough that continued. So there's just no clear relationship, and that's one of the big findings from studying the 30s.
Now, I want to mention here briefly, the book here is a bit controversial. You had a contract, I've been told, with a major academic publisher on the East Coast. They were slated to publish the book, and then they tore up the contract because of concerns about race that some academic readers, I suppose after the fact, had voiced. Can you talk about that and kind of what that says? I mean, we kind of know about academia generally, but also criminology, the discipline of criminology, how they break down and how they perceive the types of arguments you make in this book.
Well, I deal candidly with the race issue, that is, the high rates of African American crime, and I look at the different explanations for those rates. Well, of course, those things are very controversial, to say the least. And I did have a contract to publish this book with an academic publisher, and they did renege on the contract, and it was quite clear why they reneged. When an academic book is published, as you may know, Richard, it's sent out for peer review. And the peer reviews of my manuscript were extremely positive. And in this academic press, however, there was a faculty committee that also had to review all manuscripts that were to be published. And it was the faculty committee that raised objections and asked that I have additional reviewers, and stipulated that they had to be African American reviewers. And so these reviewers were not happy with the manuscript, and that's when the publisher or would-be publisher reneged and said they would not publish the book. So it was clear that this decision on their part was driven by political correctness. It was very disturbing to me at the time, to say the least, not only because of the ideological implications, but because personally, to me, it was very disturbing to have a contract and have positive reviews of the manuscript and then have it all torn up. So that was the story. I'm not naming the publisher, and I'd prefer not to name the publisher. It's still probably a very touchy issue, but I will say it's a major northeastern academic press.
Well, that's interesting, and I don't want that to sort of cloud our interview, but it does raise, to my mind, as I'm reading your book, there's a staggering array of facts you present on every page, no matter what type of argument you're making. And so it seems to me if someone's going to disagree with your book legitimately, they've got to get inside those studies and dispute your numbers or dispute your analysis of those numbers and what the data mean. Did you see that happening in the course of this rejection of your book?
No, that's one of the things that was so disturbing. The two African American reviewers did raise objections, but I had a sense from what they wrote that they were approaching it from an ideological perspective and were determined to really make mountains out of molehills. It certainly contradicted what the earlier reviewers had said. Anyone who writes a book, and especially on such a controversial issue, has to be prepared for a criticism, as you say, either someone showing that my numbers are off, that I miscalculated, or that my interpretation is off. Well, I not only expect this, I welcome it. I mean, every author who writes a serious book welcomes that kind of exchange, and I certainly do. But I don't think that's what drove this decision. I think it was quite clear that this was an ideologically driven decision, and that I find very disturbing, especially out of a major university.
And just thinking, though, on the question of race, and so I wanted to read briefly just a passage from page 110, and maybe get your comment on it, and then just think about arguments that I've heard here. So, in terms of violent crime,
yes.
Well, hold on. That was here, let me get the right passage here. So there's okay. So here we go. In terms of, so you say, as best we can tell, data are sketchy prior to the 1930s, but the late 1960s crime rise was the biggest sustained escalation in criminal violence in the United States since the 1870s. And then you say a few pages prior, I mean, we just sort of talk about the data, between 1960 and 1970, rates of violent crime in the United States, so we're talking about murder, rape, robbery, assault, more than doubled. Murder rates rose 55%. But it got worse. Bad as it was, you say. In the 1970s, the average violent crime rate rose to a shocking 452 per 100,000, only to go even higher in the 1980s, but that wasn't the peak. The average for the first half of the 1990s was a staggering 741 per 100,000. Overall, from 1960 to 1990, violent crime in the United States increased 353%. And in the wake of that, increase in violent crime, the criminal justice system staggered as to what to do. The entire complex really didn't know how to handle it. So how do you, talk about the arguments in your book. How do you see that rise in violent crime? What explains that? It's baffling to read those numbers and think about what had been the case in the 1950s versus 65 largely forward.
Yes, and it took everyone by surprise, and it certainly took the criminal justice system by surprise. It was the system was swamped, and in fact, that contributed to further rises in crime. The first explanation is demographic. You had this tremendous increase in young people, let's say roughly the ages 18 to 25. The so-called baby boom generation, which is actually my generation. And we know that violent crime is almost always committed by males and almost always committed by young males. So when you had a massive increase in this age group, in this young male age bracket, then you had at least a red flag. There's no assurance, by the way, that age group will indeed be violent. Japan, for instance, had a big increase in the 20th century in that young male age group and did not have an increase in violent crime. However, in this country, for various reasons, we did have an increase in crime amongst this age group. And crime then became a youth contagion. And when I use the word contagion, I simply mean a fad, a copying, which youth often do. And once a contagion reaches the tipping point, once it reaches a certain level of increase, it then explodes. So this is the first reason for the high violent crime in the late 1960s and thereafter. You have this baby boom generation, the fellows who came home from World War II started families, the economy was good, it was conducive to having children and starting families. And when these children came of age, 18 to 25, they engaged in a lot of violent crime. So the first explanation for this crime tsunami, really, is a demographic one.
Something that I wanted to touch on, and I did find a particular passage on race that we can also discuss. You say the violent crime wave that began in the late 1960s was a black crime phenomenon to a much greater degree than many analysts are comfortable acknowledging. And the corollary there, a substantial number of perpetrators, but also victims. So the intraracial nature of crime there. Also, another question that comes to mind, you mentioned Japan. So how about nations more, it's culturally, legally, politically more similar, Canada, United Kingdom, Australia?
Yes.
Do they see similar upticks in violent crime?
Yes, they also had increases in violent crime during this period. And that led some analysts to say, well, this was really a global, an international phenomenon. Now, if that's the case, then we would expect to see perhaps global explanations for the crime rise. But the demographic explanation was valid in some countries other than the United States. For instance, in Canada, they had a big baby boom explosion too, and they indeed had a big rise in their violent crime, although their violent crime rates are much lower than ours, so even with the increase, their rates were much lower than those in the United States. So it's possible that there are these global factors, that is, factors that affect multiple countries at the same time. But this hasn't been demonstrated. The studies show that there were some political instabilities in many countries, and that may have been associated with a rise in violent crime, and the demographic changes, and those may have been associated with a rise in violent crime. But no one has actually studied this in depth, and unfortunately I didn't have time to do that either because I was so focused on the United States. So I don't have a complete answer to your question, but it's certainly possible that there are factors affecting multiple nations at the same time, especially if those nations are somewhat similar in their cultures.
Something that occurred to me reading your book and thinking about the response of the criminal justice system to the rise in crime. I suppose maybe the answer leaping off the page is, how does any state criminal apparatus, criminal justice apparatus deal with these large increases in crime to begin with? I mean, it's hard to know what to do, and you're facing it, and here it comes, boom. But secondly, I'm thinking, were there ideological factors at play here also? Sort of, I mean, thinking about structural causes of crime, and so that influences the way you're going to deal with remedies possible or consequences for it. Or maybe even I'm thinking of another field. So that, we're in the midst of great prosperity, and so something that changes, I think, that's new in America is viewing poverty as something that can be scientifically solved or solved through policy and government, as opposed to work or business thriving and prospering, and people minding their P's and Q's and being good middle-class citizens and all of that. And sort of all this sort of factoring into, well, there are techniques we can use to manage this and solve it, short of putting people in jail for long terms. Is that at all at work, or what do you think of that?
Well, no one has come up with anything persuasive as an alternative to incarceration for serious offenders. You could see discussion often, and we're seeing it now, for instance, with respect to the heroin problem, which seems to be increasing. You could see discussions there about alternative ways of dealing with that problem. For instance, some have said it should be heroin, that is, and various addictions to pills, codeine-based pills, should be treated as a public health problem. Well, fine. I think those may be promising alternatives, but are you going to make the same case for violent rapists, for murderers, for armed robbers? I don't think so. I don't think anyone's going to say, well, let's treat that like a public health problem, and let's see if we can't resolve this guy's issues as a way of preventing him from doing more armed robberies. Everyone's going to want to be protected from people like that. So from the standpoint of incapacitation alone, imprisonment seems to be the answer. And you know, Richard, imprisonment itself was a fairly new development at the founding of this country in the late 18th century. That was the novel treatment for crime. Prior to that, it was either capital punishment or what they called transportation. That is, they put you on a boat and sent you to some other country. In fact, that's partly the way our country was populated in the South, and Australia as well. Georgia. The English put criminals on a boat and transported them. But prison is, in the last 200 years or so, the only way we know of to deal with serious crime, and by that I include serious violent crime at least. So we're going to see alternative proposals for less serious offenses, and I think that's fine. But that's not the prison problem. That's not the mass incarceration problem. That's not the serious crime problem.
One question, just thinking along the lines of the passage that I read about race and this crime wave phenomenon, and you have a lot of statistics. A lot of those are certainly were eye-opening to me. So my question, and coming back to my most sustained exposure to criminal law, criminal procedure, what I was always told is, well, these disparities in arrests and imprisonment by race are the result of selection bias. Or I should say selection bias, the way policing was done, where cops choose to hang out, disparities in legal representation, all of these sorts of things factor in, and you have to take that into account. You can't just blindly list statistics. Where is that? Is that right, sort of right, or just plain wrong in your research?
Well, if the issue is it correct to say that African Americans have high rates of violent crime, or is that just a byproduct of selective law enforcement? Then my answer is no, African Americans have high rates of violent crime. And here's how we could be pretty sure that that's the case. We have measures that are outside of the criminal justice system and are not tainted by any bias. And the two that are the best ones are, first, we have mortality data, which is actually collected by the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control in Washington. They collect data from medical examiners, the guys who used to be called coroners, who are located in every county in the country, in every state in the country. And they collect data on homicides, that is, killings, and this is not determined by the criminal justice system. This is determined by medical people. They determine whether someone dies because of an assault by another person. That's essentially the definition of a homicide. And so we have data which can be broken down by race, which indicates the rate of homicide by race and by age and by all sorts of factors. So we know, based on those data, we know that the African American homicide victimization rates are 7 to 8 times, currently, 7 to 8 times the white rates. So now this is outside the criminal justice system. Police have nothing to do with this data. It's clear that there's a lot of killing going on. Mostly 94 times out of 100, it's a black killing another black person. So we know this is the case. So it should be no surprise that we have high murder rates, using now the legal terminology, the criminal justice terminology, that we have high murder rates among blacks because we have high homicide victimization rates among blacks, and the data to support that are really incontrovertible. There's a second measure, but I'll let you jump in. And
No, I was just going to mention that. The other one was the National Crime Victim Survey.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. Now, this, of course, doesn't cover murder. You can't interview murder victims for obvious reasons. They're dead. But it does cover victims of other violent crimes, robberies and assaults, most notably. Now, when it's the Census Bureau that conducts these surveys, they're conducted annually, and they cover about 80,000 people, which is massive in terms of surveys. The political polls are maybe 1,200 people. This is 80,000 people a year. So we know these surveys are quite accurate. And we also know what the victimization rate is, and we have information about perpetrators. So the victims are asked, is the perpetrator white or black or something else? And the answers then can be tabulated, and we can then determine from that who the offenders are. So these two measures, the victim survey and the mortality data, are really unimpeachable. And if you match up the rates of arrest with those data, let's say arrest for murders, and you match up the imprisonment rates with those data, which I point out in the book, match up pretty closely, then we know that the criminal justice system cannot be far off when it determines that African Americans have high rates both of crime victimization and crime causation, crime offending.
Coming forward now, maybe more towards present day. So we've got, there's a lot going on with the increase in crime. And another thing you mentioned is just the mobilization of American life, or the patterns of way people are moving seem to influence that also. But coming more towards the end of that period and what brought it down, I thought was interesting. So we experienced a dramatic decrease in this crime wave in the mid-'90s. Something that I thought was interesting in your book is humility, or rather, I think your humility about identifying causes and solutions and saying we really don't know what did it. We have some factors seem to play a role, but we don't have sort of a total, clear, complete grasp of what brought this crime wave to an end. You mentioned incarceration in the book as being partially explainable, but it seems to me your big explanation in your mind is just the baby boomers, that they got old. They fell out of the crime. As you say, they retired from crime because of age. And maybe that's the reason why it went down.
Well, I think that was a big factor. And see, that's one of the benefits, in my view, Richard, of looking at this thing historically. I noticed, I think Atlantic Magazine has a new article on this question, why did crime decline? And they just take a very narrow view because they don't have the historical breadth that I'm trying to offer here. Well, when you look at the thing historically, what you see is that violent crime rates actually started declining in the early 80s, not in the 90s, in the 80s. So I asked myself, well, why should that be? And then when I looked, I saw that those who had done the most crime in the late 60s and throughout the 70s were now what we call aging out. They were entering their middle 30s their early 40s. They were too old to engage in violent crime. So I said, well, now I know why crime was starting to fall in the 80s. It's because the people who were doing all the crime, the baby boomers, were getting too old. Well, but that leaves a puzzlement. Why does crime turn up again in the late 80s, at the end of the decade? And that one is easier to answer, actually. That's the time of the crack cocaine boom. And crack causes a lot of violent crime for two reasons. First of all, it affected a very impoverished population, and so they couldn't support their habit without engaging in a lot of crime, not only theft crime, but violent crime as well, robberies, for instance. And so robbery rates spike up again. And the other way they affect violent crime is you have the distribution of the crack cocaine being handled by young gangs who are armed, and so they compete for turf, start shooting one another, and also hurt innocent bystanders, and that too drives the rates back up. So it was the children of the baby boomers, especially in poor and black communities, that drove the crime rates up again in the late 80s and in the early 1990s. And once that crack cocaine epidemic abated, then the crime fall continued. And it abated in part because of the terrible effects of the cocaine on youth. It made them very ill. It sometimes killed them. It gave them mental and emotional problems as well as physical problems. And because the criminal justice system had toughened up, and this plays into the political controversy over Bill Clinton's crime bill, and it finally, because the baby boomers were out of the picture, they were definitely, by the 90s, too old to commit violent crimes. So that started the great crime decline, roughly 1994 or thereabouts. And it's been downhill ever since, and now everyone is asking, is that the end of the slide? Are we now facing a new rise?
Something that is interesting. So, everyone talks about sort of the New York strategy, the Giuliani and the Bratton strategy, data-driven policing, more aggressive about arrest, enforcing prison sentences, things like that. You notice other cities don't employ the strategy, and they have decreases in crime.
Right. So
what do we do with that?
Well, here's my conclusion, Richard. I mean, I was a big fan of Giuliani. I thought he and Bratton, the younger Bratton, that is Bratton the first time around, Bratton won. I mean, I thought they did a great job. They addressed the city's needs. The city needed to take back the streets, and they were addressing that, and that was smart and right. But, politicians tend to take credit for lots of things that they really can't take credit for. And Giuliani was not the mayor of Seattle. He was the mayor of New York. So if Seattle's rates fell and they didn't even adopt New York-style police policies, how can Giuliani take credit for that, right? I mean, the chief in Seattle said, well, we don't know why the crime rates went down. So obviously something national was going on, something nationwide was happening, and that's why I think these other factors are so important. I think the end of the crack cocaine epidemic was nationwide. The aging of the boomers was nationwide. The toughening of the system overall across the United States was obviously nationwide. And so that's why you have a nationwide decline. New York did better, as my criminologist colleague Franklin Zimring liked to point out, but it didn't do better than all cities. It did better than a lot of other big cities, however.
So maybe I just wanted to get your thoughts on a lot of things that are in current circulation, which I think, obviously, in your book, this historiographical approach that you take to crime in the 20th century, I think gives you an interesting and unique perspective on this. So Ta-Nehisi Coates in The Atlantic argued mass incarceration as a solution of a racist nation to to crime and stigmatizing in particular black men. And then that has that argument is also in the forefront, I think, of the Democratic Party's debate. And in particular, you see Bernie Sanders kind of throw this at Hillary Clinton by virtue of Bill Clinton's crime bill. Mass incarceration also now playing into, it's bipartisan, Rand Paul arguing in conjunction with certain or liberal members that this means we need to have sentencing reform, and particularly have too many people stuffed in our prisons. I've seen people compare our current prison population, state and federal, to the size of the Gulag Archipelago at its height in the Soviet Union. And people arguing this is also about the drug war. People are thrown in prison because of the drug war. How do you come out? I mean, I know I've thrown a lot at you, but this all seems to be a complex of facts that people just associate and make this argument writ large. And how do you assess this or disaggregate the phenomena?
Okay, first off, I mean, one has to look back at the crime rise. The rise in imprisonment rates, which is real, and it was a tremendous rise, and I deal with that in my book. I don't try to paper over that rise in the imprisonment rates. But that came out of a context. The context was the biggest rise in violent crime in American history, which started in the late 60s, and as you said correctly, meant a rise of 353% in violent crime rates. So this is a context for the criminal justice system toughening up. The other context was when crime began to rise in the late 60s, the system actually caved. The system was too weak and actually softened. So, and there's a lot of evidence for this. For instance, in the 1950s and in the early 60s, if you were convicted of a robbery, you'd serve a median 34 to 37 months. If you were convicted of that same robbery in the 1970s and the 1980s, you'd only serve 25 months. So the system actually got weaker in the face of the big rise in crime. So all of this is leading up to this point. The policies to imprison people had changed, and we're not entirely sure, by the way, which had the greater impact on imprisonment, whether there were more arrests, more sentences to prison of people who might ordinarily get probation instead of prison, or whether the prison sentences were longer. We're not entirely sure what increased these prison rates. But the point is the policies were a response to not only a massive increase in violent crime, but a massive failure of the criminal justice system to deal with it. Now, to me, the answer is obvious. This had to happen. The American public was terrified and upset and angry. And by the way, the fears were much greater in black communities than in white communities. Coates is too young to know about that, perhaps, but he should look at the data. Blacks, especially in cities, were much more frightened than whites because they were much more victimized by violent crime than whites, as a matter of fact. So everyone, and certainly the black leaders, demanded a toughening up of the system. Did it hit black people, and especially black males, harder? Proportionately, it did. But remember, blacks were responsible for more than half of the robberies and more than half of the murders in the United States during this period. And I've already explained to you why, in fact, those figures are accurate and reflect real crime and not just some bias in enforcement. So I think the policy changes were necessary at the time. We can debate which ones we ought to change now, but they were necessary at the time. They were essential, and in fact, they were effective. They helped bring down crime rates. And one last point, Richard, and this is not well known, and there was just an article condemning mass incarceration, an op-ed in the Times the other day, which makes this same mistake. The argument is sometimes made, well, look, mass incarceration is obviously unnecessary anymore nowadays because we've locked up all the serious offenders we can at this point. We're now dipping into the less serious offenders in order to maintain this mass incarceration system. Well, that's nonsense. First of all, when we lock people up for crimes, let's say violent crimes, which is my focal point, we are only locking up about 1/4 of those who actually commit violent crimes, and maybe even half of that. If you talk about reported violent crimes, perhaps 24% are imprisoned, and the other 76% who were accused of violent crimes are not imprisoned. So even though crime rates are low, there are plenty of violent offenders who are not being incarcerated. And so it's just silly to say that we now have to dip down into the nonviolent and non-serious offender mix in order to fill up our prisons. That just isn't true.
How do you come down, though, just on the thinking about the sentencing reform? An argument is our prison populations are large, and a huge part of that size is due to this drug war. And as we've been discussing, you talked about the uptick in crime in the late 80s being a part of the crack cocaine epidemic, and so that also feeds into, well, how did the government pursue policies against drug use and drug selling and things like that? And so is this a problem? Do we have a lot of people in prison for drug dealing or drug possession, and it's just sort of silly, and now the sort of common sense is moving more towards, if not a legalization regime, a non-punishment rehabilitation regime?
There was never more than 20% of the prison population in for drug crimes, and that was at the peak. The percentage now, if you look at all state and federal prisoners, is 16%. So that means that 84% of all state and federal prisoners are in for non-drug offenses. In the federal prisons, where there's much more emphasis on drug crimes because the feds don't have jurisdiction over the ordinary violent crimes, percentage of offenders in for drug crimes is very high, and 95% of those are in for dealing. That is, they're in for trafficking in drugs. So the notion, that the prisons are filled with pot smokers and harmless personal users of drugs is just not true. Jails, perhaps, but remember, jails are short stay institutions. They're not like prisons. So prisons are still for violent crimes. 54% of all prisoners are in for violent crimes. 19% are in for serious property crimes like burglary. 11% are in for weapons offenses. So we have to face realities. If we want to reduce incarceration, we still have to reckon with the fact that the prisons are filled with very serious offenders, and we're not likely to be able to release them.
On this question of just the overall size of our prison system. So we've basically, it's almost, you would argue it's not, I don't know if you would argue this, but it seems to be it's an immovable object in terms of, so we have a violent crime problem. Therefore we have a large prison system in America, and that's, we can quibble about the social disorder that reflects, but at the where the rubber meets the road, that's just what we've got to deal with.
I'm afraid so. I mean, of course, crime rates go up and crime rates go down. So, the rates of crime can get worse, and we may have to start locking up more people. And when rates are low, as they have been since the mid-1990s, we can lock up fewer people. But we're not going to be able to empty out the prisons unless you want to release some very serious offenders. Even the ones that President Obama released from the federal prison had already served a long terms.
Yeah.
So, I mean, these were not, newly committed offenders, although they were, I think, overwhelmingly drug traffickers.
Yeah.
So, I just think we have to be realistic about this, Richard. If tomorrow you could take out of prison all the drug offenders, okay? Tomorrow we could just release all the drug offenders and leave everyone else in. We'd leave in 84% of our prison population.
Still a large amount. On something that's received a lot of press, now there's a new book by Heather McDonald to this effect. I wish I had the title. I had it on the top of my head as we entered the interview. The Ferguson Effect.
Yes.
And that we saw in 2015 a slight uptick in crime. And part of this, she comes to mind because of the book, and she seems to be the one that writes the most op-eds. McDonald argues, she argues that this is because police, after that Ferguson tragedy fiasco, became afraid to do their jobs, and they're letting crime go, and they're not doing this active policing anymore. So we're seeing an uptick in crime. And this is also related to sort of the new social justice warrior aggressive mentality going on in the country, which is affecting police departments. Is she making too much out of the data? I mean, I think from your perspective, you're working all the way back to the 1870s. She's talking about 1 year. So is there anything that can be made of this, or does she have something?
I don't know yet. I don't think anyone knows yet. I mean, Heather's pretty bold and brave, and she sometimes goes out on a limb with these things. I don't know what her data are like. She hasn't shared it with me. I would say you would have to look, and this is tricky, of course, you would have to look pre-Ferguson or whatever the incident was that changed, a particular city like Baltimore. You'd have to look before the incident, and you'd have to look at some police activity that might have been affected by that incident. Let's say, giving traffic summonses, or giving what they call desk appearance tickets in New York, essentially a summons to appear in court in lieu of an arrest. You'd have to look at some activity by the police that involves a confrontation between the police and citizens, and you'd have to see if those confrontations declined. And if you can pinpoint it to precincts where you have a big African American population, that might even be a better indicator. So you'd have to do a pre and a post analysis with that kind of confrontation behavior, especially in an African American precinct. Now, that's how I would structure a study to look at this Ferguson effect. And then you'd have to do the same thing for multiple cities to really see if it's, nationwide and not just in Ferguson, Missouri. So I don't think anyone's done that yet. And until they do, I'm going to be skeptical about the quality of the study. That doesn't mean there's no Ferguson effect. Maybe police are demoralized. Several mayors have said that they are, and police demoralization is a serious problem because, after all, when there's violence and there's trouble, you and I could walk the other way, and cops can't. So, their demoralization, their unwillingness to face what could be a very violent and dangerous situation could put the rest of us in jeopardy. So there may be a Ferguson effect. I don't see the proof yet. I'll look forward to seeing Heather's data and arguments on this. By the way, I have this. I place this whole issue of constraints on the police in a broader context as well. There was a crime historian named Eric Munkin, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago, who argued that there's actually a cyclical effect with violent crime. That what happens is when violent crime is low, people forget about the big eras of big violence, and they tend to weaken the social controls on violence. So that would include trends such as we see now to reduce the punitive nature of the criminal justice system, constrain the police in some way, reduce imprisonment, etc. Well, what happens, Monckton argues, is that when these social controls are diminished, crime begins to rise. He's talking about violent crime here. And when violent crime begins to rise, people get upset and they call for a reinstitution of the social controls, and that helps bring crime down again. So he argued that you had this cycle where people called for more controls, crime went down, and then they'd want fewer controls. And it's an interesting proposition. I'm not sure if it's true. We may find out, because certainly the trend now, Richard, I would say, is to reduce the social controls. For various reasons, people think that the system is too punitive now, and they want to relax these controls. And we'll see if it helps bring on a new rise in crime.
So maybe the way we can end our interview is stay tuned. It does not end. Barry Latzer, thank you. Thank you for your time today. We've been discussing your Barry Latzer's latest book, The Rise and Fall of Violent Crime in America. Great discussion.
Thanks so much, Richard.
This is your host, Richard Greinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.